Hey there guys, it is Siwasepl and welcome to my final thoughts on Crash Bandicoot the Insane Trilogy for the PlayStation 4. Normally I would talk about the good, the bad, and what it was like to let's play the game. This time, it's going to be a little different. Because this is a remake and I've already talked about the previous games, I'm only going to be talking about what I felt the remakes did good and did bad. And then at the end, along with the summary, I will tell you, in my opinion, which version I think is the better one. If you wish to see my thoughts on Crash Bandicoot for the PlayStation 1, a link for it will be in the description and on this video right now, or at least it should be. As well as my thoughts on Crash Bandicoot 2 and Crash Bandicoot Warped all tied together. I did play all three of these games before I played this remake trilogy, and the only game that I have any nostalgic connection to is Crash Bandicoot 2, so keep that in mind as you listen to my thoughts. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get on with the good of the Insane Trilogy. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some good things that share across all games. And then I'm going to break it down into each individual game and talk about what I thought were the good improvements of it. So first up, obviously the big main improvement is the graphics. This game looks really good. Everything's been remade, everything pops, everything looks better. Now, if it looks better than the originals, that is going to be a question up for debate. But as just on its own, I think the graphics of it look pretty fantastic. They have also updated the controls. Now, I don't mean update in the way that they've changed the controls. It just feels better to play this game overall, which we'll get to in a bit more detail here in a second. It's a much more modern control feeling, and it feels like the game was meant to be done with the PlayStation 4 controller. And as a really tiny bonus, you get to play as Coco in all three games at some point. Now, you could do that in Crash Bandicoot Warped, but only for certain levels, and now you can just play Coco for every single level, excluding some certain boss levels, and Crash-only levels. But it's still a nice little addition to the overall package. Now let's go ahead and move into talking about each of the games individually, which first will be Crash 1. Now Crash 1, in my final thoughts, I was not too kind to that game. I thought overall it was a good game, but heavily flawed due to all of the restraints and constrictions that came with being on the PlayStation 1, as well as a lot of weird design choices. Such as the save system. The save system in the original was awful. Now, they've revamped it. You can save anytime you want as long as you're not in a level. So no longer do you have to worry about any progress being lost because you just couldn't reach that gem, or you just couldn't get that third Tawna token. All your worries are now gone in that aspect. In addition to being able to save your games, your lives now carry over. So if you didn't know, in the original Crash, you would start with 4 lives every time you loaded up the game, whether you saved or not. Now, that is no longer an issue. You can just have all the lives that you had in your previous gaming session. They have also made it a bit more easier to travel along the map of Crash Bandicoot 1. Now, it just feels a lot more fluid. And they also put in a few shortcuts to go to the ends of the first and last island, so you can quickly jump to a closer point that you need to be. Speaking of levels, that's another bonus. Now, this wasn't the case when the game first came out, but now that the game is out and it's been out for a while, they've actually added a new level, Stormy Ascent, one of the first cut levels from Crash Bandicoot 1 back when it was first being made. It's nice to see this included in the game because it was a part of Crash Bandicoot's history, and I think a lot of people actually wanted to see this happen. So it's just a good little incentive for returning players of Crash Bandicoot to continue playing the same game that they've already played. I would like to add a little extension remark. What I talked about earlier, with all games, the controls have been improved, but this one I feel like Crash Bandicoot 1 needed the most improvement in the controls. The original felt very stiff and very rigid, and not fun to control. And that's all fixed now. He controls fantastically in Crash Bandicoot 1, and it eliminates a lot of issues with being able to do platforming and certain jumps. It also helps that they fixed the hitboxes of certain objects, so no longer will you have to worry about that one spike pillar in the hog levels. Moving on to Crash Bandicoot 2, this is where we start seeing less improvements made, in my opinion. Really, some of the big ones are the fact that they added the dash ability from Crash Bandicoot 3, and along with time trials, which were also included in Crash Bandicoot 1, but feel like they're a better place here in Crash Bandicoot 2, along with the sliding and the crouch jumping, as well as now the dash ability. They've also allowed easier access to the secret levels. Before, there was really no way to get to the secret levels without going to the levels and taking the secret exit. Now, you just go down the warp rooms. It's the last one, and you don't have to worry about having to go into each level in order to pop through. You can just go back anytime you want and be able to mark your progress. That's pretty much it for all the improvements of Crash Bandicoot 2 that I feel are necessary to make. There are a bunch of little improvements across the board everywhere, but really notable ones, that's it. And the same kind of goes for Crash Bandicoot 3. There aren't really any notable changes that I feel impact the game and make it better. Crash Bandicoot 3 was already a good enough game on its own. They just kind of took improvements from this game and added it to the previous two games. So Crash Bandicoot 3 is really the same game, essentially, excluding a few minor issues and complaints, which we will address now in the bad section. Starting off the bad section, just like I did the good section, let's go ahead and talk about some things that just are present throughout the entire collection. A minor thing is that despite this collection looking really fantastic, sometimes the colors don't always look right. Sometimes they look slightly saturated, sometimes they look oversaturated. Most of the time it's fine, but there are a few colors that stand out that just don't seem to be right. And a little side note, a personal thing, why doesn't this game support HDR? This would be the perfect game to do that. And as far as I know, at the time of recording this, there is no HDR support for this game. Another small thing is that there just didn't seem to be a whole lot of unlockable extras. You get the dash power up in Crash Bandicoot 2 and you get to play as Coco in all the games. But I feel like there could have been just a little bit more, even if it was just concept art or a low poly crash model. That would have been nice, just for completing all the games, because you don't get Coco for completing the games. You just get to play Coco. The only power-up that you get to unlock is the dash power-up in Crash Bandicoot 2 that you have to beat the entire game for. It just would have been nice to have another small little thing to want to go back and replay it immediately after beating it. Moving on to my two biggest complaints for this collection. The loading times. The loading times are just awful. Terrible. It will sometimes take me 5 minutes just going from the start screen to being able to play one of the levels. Now that doesn't sound too bad, but when you can't skip the intro splash screens, that's also an issue. The loading screens will take 40 seconds sometimes. Now, they could be 15 seconds, sure, but a lot of times they're going to be somewhere closer to the 40-second range. And when you want to just immediately go from level to level, that can be an issue, especially in Crash Bandicoot Warps, where the loading times were kind of fast. You could go in and out of a level pretty quickly and be able to pick up the time trials right then and there. Now, they did kind of fix it by allowing you to restart the levels at any time, but that's only available when you're doing a time trial, so it doesn't really work out too well. The other big one is, why isn't this game at 60 FPS? There is no excuse. You could say, well, the original Crash wasn't, but It was on the PlayStation 1, it had inferior hardware, this is the PlayStation 4. It just seems to be a kick in the teeth to all the players that actually wanted 60 FPS. I don't see a reason for this game to not be. You could argue again that it's graphically intensive, but I don't even think that. There are many more graphically intensive games on this system, and even they were able to achieve 60 FPS. If you look at the multiplayer for Uncharted, they had to lower the resolution, but it was possible. So I'm definitely counting this as a very negative thing on this collection. Moving on to the individual games. For Crash 1, there aren't really that many complaints. A lot of them are minor. Some of the segments are just a little bit too difficult. Just at least more difficult than the original Crash Bandicoot, specifically the bridge levels. It seems like jumping on the turtles is a bit harder to do this time than it was in the original, and I don't know if that's because of the leap in graphical change, or maybe in the new aspect ratio or the control systems. Something's causing it, and it just seems to be just a little bit more difficult. Also with jumping in general, when riding a hog, it also seems to be a little bit more difficult to maintain air in this one than it did the original. Now, to be completely hypocritical, I don't think there's enough challenge in it anymore. Now, I'm not saying that what they provided is not a fun experience, because they did provide a fun experience, but adding the save system and being able to keep the lives, it kinda just takes away from the original challenge of Crash Bandicoot 1. They could have improved the controls and done all those other minor improvements, and then had an Iron Man mode or a hardcore mode where it has the original rules from Crash Bandicoot 1, where you don't get to save unless you have a gem or a bonus round, and you can't keep your lives. That would have been a better compromise. Still have the actual game and all its improvements, and then also have a hardcore mode for the really dedicated fans, so they don't have to keep going back to Crash Bandicoot 1 for that challenge. For Crash Bandicoot 2, on the other hand, there are less things to complain about. My main complaint is that certain gem exploits were taken out. There was one level where you could just, if you were good enough, you could slide jump off a ledge and get the red gem way before you're supposed to. They basically made that impossible to do in the remake. I would have liked to have seen that exploit stay in, because it wasn't game breaking and it wasn't breaking the functionality of the game. It was only strictly if you are able to do that exploit, and I just think it would have been a better idea to keep it in there. That way the players that could do it and choose to do it could, in theory, still do it. Now there is no option for it, so I feel less excited. At least for me. I know whenever I would play Crash Bandicoot 2, I would always try to get the red gem before I was supposed to. Even though I only ever did it once, I think. It would have just been nice to have. Now, weirdly enough, I have more to talk about with Crash Bandicoot 3. Let's keep with the difficulty talk going on here. Some of the relics for the time trials feel harder. Like they've lessened the time and they're being more constrictive on it, or maybe some of the boxes didn't have the right amount of time freezing in it. But for some reason, certain levels, especially like the later levels, felt harder to get the gold relic than it did in the original. Felt like a lot of times you were cutting it really close. It also doesn't help when you can't get to the secret levels without going through the levels. This is something they fixed in Crash Bandicoot 2, but yet in Crash Bandicoot 3 they decided not to fix for some reason. The two levels, Hot Cocoa and Eggapis Rex, you can't get to without going through the levels with the secret warps. And instead of allowing you to be able to just go to a warp room that will take you there, you still have to go through those levels. It doesn't make any sense why they fixed it in Crash Bandicoot 2 but not in Crash 3. Especially when those levels also have relics and gems in them. It would have just been nice to be able to track those alongside the other levels. The last major complaint I have is that the vehicles don't always feel right. I say that, but what I really mean is that they could have really done some improvements on the vehicles. The jet skis feel more sluggish than they originally did, and the motorcycle just doesn't feel as fast as it did in the original. And the planes are still just as bad. Feels like they made no improvements to the vehicles whatsoever, and in some cases made them worse. With all the improvements made to the previous two games, you'd think they would have at least tried to make improvements on Crash Bandicoot 3. But like I said in the good, this game seems to be largely untouched by their improvements and remake. Now, with all my complaints out of the way, let's go ahead and get to the summary of the Insane Trilogy and which version do I think is the best. So, the Insane Trilogy, overall, it looks amazing with the graphical improvements. It sounds great. The controls have been super improved, and there have been a wide range of improvements made across all three games, except for Crash Bandicoot 3, which seems to have the least done to it. And it also seems to have the most problems with it. A lot of the problems for Crash Bandicoot 1 has been fixed, and they've made Crash Bandicoot 2 a more enjoyable experience by giving more access to the secret levels. On top of all that, you get all three of the original Crash Bandicoot games in one package, and all three of them are incredibly faithful to their original games, with some issues in Crash Bandicoot 3 and in Crash Bandicoot 2, with some challenge issues in Crash Bandicoot 1. Overall, it feels like you are playing the same games, just on a much more powerful system. So it is very easy to recommend the Insane Trilogy as a good remake. As for which game's version is better, let's talk about that. For Crash Bandicoot 1, I think it's very easy for me to say that the remake is the better version of Crash 1. You get a better save system, it controls better, it looks better, and overall is basically the same game. Like I said, just with less challenge, and that could be a good or a bad thing depending on who you are. Now this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because Crash Bandicoot 2, I think the original is better. Now why do I think that? Mainly because it's nostalgia driven. I don't like that they took out the exploits for the gems, but they do give easier access to the secret levels, which I think is a plus. And it's strictly because I played Crash Bandicoot 2 when I was a kid. So I think the PlayStation 1 version is a superior version to it. If you were to take away the nostalgia, I think you could easily say that the remake is a better version. The same idea applies to Crash Bandicoot 3. Now I'm undecided on this, strictly because Crash Bandicoot 3 is Crash Bandicoot 3. If you played the original Crash Bandicoot 3 when you were young, you're probably going to like the original a lot better than you like the remake. Now, if this is the first time you're playing it, the remake will be just as fine as the original because they're pretty much the same game, with a few more challenging segments in the remake. But overall, it's the same game. So again, it comes down strictly to nostalgia. And that is my final thoughts on Crash Bandicoot the Insane Trilogy, as well as which version I think is best. Thank you guys so much for watching and listening to all my thoughts. If you would like to listen to some more final thoughts, I've got links on the screen right now. The last one I did was on Azura's Wrath for the PlayStation 3, and the one before that was on Killer is Dead for the PlayStation 3, as well as many others. Well, I say many others, but it's like five others. But the playlist is up there as well, so you can go ahead and click that, and I am going to head to the next thing, whatever it may be. And I hope to see you there.